Welcome to the next presentation in our series on the Second Commandment in Law, History, and Prophecy. This is the first of three presentations on the topic of God's law in the Old Testament. And our specific subject for today is the Hebrew concept of law. Before we begin, let us pray. Lord, give us a clearer understanding of your word so that we can live lives in accordance with your will. Amen. In our last presentation, we looked specifically at the Second Commandment, and we learned that the Second Commandment is one of the broadest of the 10 commandments, but yet its value is not always appreciated, neither is its meaning always understood, because we saw that beyond simply defining and forbidding false worship, this precept also deals with a wide range of issues which touch upon our relationship with God and our responsibilities to God. And we also saw that the second commandment is the gospel commandment, about how gospel principles and the principles of law are blended together in this commandment so that there is an inseparable link between the two. Oftentimes, however, when it comes to the law, we hear Christians make statements such as the following: "Oh, we're not under the law, but under grace. The old covenant has been done away with. Christians are under the law of Christ, not the law of Moses. We're not under bondage to the law because the law has been nailed to the cross. And Christians are saved apart from the works of the law." And when we hear statements such as this, the question behind all of these statements is essentially the same. Do the 10 commandments still really matter? And that's a question that has been long debated among Christians. As a matter of fact, for centuries, there's been an ongoing debate among Christians concerning the continuing authority and applicability of the Old Testament laws, the law of Moses, the Mosaic law, including the 10 commandments. And this issue is critical for our study as well as for our belief and experience as Christians. Three simple reasons why, among many, is first of all, if the 10 commandments make up one law, but if the 10 commandments have been abolished at the cross, then that means that none of the commandments, including the second commandment, which is prominent among the 10 commandments, none of them matter any longer. Therefore, what's the point in even conducting this study? We saw in our focus on the second commandment that this commandment, however, connects to the gospel as well as to judgment. So if there's something in this commandment that we need to know about, then we have to be careful of just brushing this to the side. Also, the second commandment addresses issues of worship, which, as we're going to see going forward in our study, play a very key role in New Testament theology as well as eschatology. In other words, what the New Testament has to say about who God is and what he does, as well as what the New Testament has to say about the end times. So, the 10 commandments are one law, as the Apostle James pointed out in James chapter 2, verses 8 through 12, which reads, "If you really fulfill the royal law, according to the scriptures, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. So we see that according to James, though there are 10 commandments, there's only one law. And so we have to just consider, how should we view the law and its continuing application to our lives today? Well, in general, Protestant Christians have taken three positions on this issue of the perpetuity of the law. Reconstructionists argue that the Old Testament law as a whole continues to apply to Christians as well as modern society. So they believe that the law, all of the Old Testament laws as written, should be applied as the law of the land today. That's what Reconstructionists believe, also known as dominionists. Dispensationalists, which includes most evangelicals, they argue the opposite, that the Old Testament law as a whole has been done away with, abolished in the church area, although they turn around and argue that parts of it were subsequently reinstated for Christians. Of the 10 commandments, guess which one they say has not been reinstated for Christians? Reformed tradition Christians, however, argue that parts of the Old Testament law have always continued to apply in the New Testament era, whereas other parts of Old Testament law have been discontinued. So according to Reformed tradition Christians, there's parts of Old Testament law that still apply to Christians, and there's parts that no longer apply. So the questions that we are going to be examining in these next three presentations as we look at the God's law in the Old Testament is, first, what key words does the Old Testament use to describe divine law? How are these words related, and what do they reveal about the Hebrew view of the law? It is this first question that we will be dealing with today. The other questions deal with the distinctions that the Bible makes between different categories of law. First, moral, civil, and ceremonial law, which we'll look at in the next presentation. And then in the following presentation, we will look at the distinction between principal and ancillary laws. So the key points that we will be covering in these next three lessons are, first, due to necessary overlap between the categories and terminology of Old Testament law, the usual distinction between moral, civil, and ceremonial laws, although still valid, is not as clear-cut as many people suppose. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, as we're going to find out. The second key point is that a clear biblical difference between principal and ancillary laws signals clearly the unique status of the 10 commandment laws, of the 10 commandment law, including the second commandment. Now, today we're going to be engaging in a word study, and it's important that we understand something about the method of biblical word studies. This was a approach to the scripture that was used quite often, not only by the Protestant reformers, but as we're going to find out, it was also used by New Testament writers and teachers. So this is a method of Bible study that we find illustrated in the Bible itself. And for that reason, it's important that we let the Bible guide us in how to properly use this method so that we can rightly divide the word of truth. And so, looking at how this method of Bible study is illustrated in the Bible, we see that there are 3 steps. The first step is to examine the dictionary meaning of the word in its original language. So, for example, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, we're told, quoting from the Old Testament, behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. The writer then goes on to translate this word in the original language, which is translated God with us. We find another example in the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. Once again, quoting from the Old Testament, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. Then Paul goes on to translate the words that are used in that title. Melchizedek, first being translated King of Righteousness. And then he goes on to further translate that phrase, King of Salem, meaning King of Peace. So the first step in a biblical word study is just to simply look at the dictionary meaning in the original language. And we know that the Bible was written in 3 original languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The second step is to pay attention to the grammatical form of the word. Here we are dealing with whether the word is singular or plural. Is it present tense, past tense, future tense? Is it first person, second person, third person? So this is an aspect of the word study where you may need to go brush off your English grammar, because it will actually be helpful to you in even understanding the grammar of biblical languages. So we see 2 examples of where the grammatical form of a word made a difference in the interpretation of an Old Testament passage. Galatians chapter 3, verse 16. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say, and to seeds, plural, as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, singular, who is Christ. So we see that sometimes the grammatical form of a single word can make the difference in how a particular verse is understood. We see another example of this from the teaching of Jesus in Mark chapter 12, verse 26 and 27. We're speaking concerning the resurrection. He said, but concerning the dead, that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the burning bush passage, how God spoke to him, saying, I am, present tense, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. So what was Jesus's point? His point is that Moses did not say that God said, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, past tense, but he said, I am, present tense. And based on the tense of that single word, Jesus understood that the resurrection would occur, because God is the God present tense of the living, not of the past tense dead. So to God, all live to him, because he views things in light of the resurrection. So we see that the second step is to pay attention to the grammatical form of the word, because sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it can make a difference in how you need to interpret the verse. The third, and we see another example of where grammatical form makes a difference in the earlier verse that we looked at, when we established the 10 commandments as one law. Notice what James said in James chapter 2. In verse 8, he says, if you really fulfill the royal law, singular, In verse 10, he says, for whoever shall keep the whole law, singular, not plural. In verse 12, he says, so speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law, singular, not plural, of liberty. So once again, we pay attention to grammatical form because that can make a difference in certain situations. The third step is to pay attention to context. And here, remember the statement, context is king. In other words, context rules over the first 2 points. The dictionary meaning, the grammatical form, context is the ultimate factor that we need to pay attention to. How the word is used within the particular historical and literary setting that we find it in. So context is king. So with context, we need to pay attention, first of all, to the historical context, the time and place where the statement was made. We see an example of this in Romans chapter 4, verses 3 through 10. I just summarized it here, but you can read the entire thing. And we can see that here, Paul pays attention to the historical context in which a particular statement was made in order to arrive at its understanding. He says, for what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God and it was accounted. He's focusing on that word accounted to him for righteousness. You can find that in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. Paul then goes on to focus on this word accounted. How then was it accounted? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. So notice that Paul pays attention to the fact that this word accounting righteousness to Abraham was made to him by God while he was still uncircumcised. And based on that, Paul goes on to argue that salvation by grace through faith is made available to everyone, whether they are circumcised or whether they are uncircumcised, whether they are Jews or whether they are Gentiles. The historical context of that single word made the difference in how Paul interpreted this verse and arrived at his understanding of salvation by grace through faith. Context is king. But it's not just historical context, it's also literary context. Here we're paying attention to the type of writing, to the structure of the writing, and other things about the particular passage in which a particular word is used in. We find an example of this in how a particular word, abustos, which is translated abyss, is used in the New Testament. In the Gospels and in Revelation, this Greek word abustos refers to a place appointed by God for displaced demons and for satanic forces that are being held in check. So we can find several examples of this use of the word abustos throughout the New Testament, in the book of Luke, and in several places in the book of Revelation. However, Paul, when he is writing to the Romans, he quoted from the Greek version of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint. And he quoted from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 12 and 13. And he makes this quotation in Romans chapter 10, verses 6 and 7. And here, Paul uses the same word abustos, abyss, not to refer to a place for displaced demons or satanic forces that are being held in check, but he instead uses it to refer to the grave where displaced humans, in other words, dead humans, are appointed to reside by God. Now, in what sense is a dead person displaced? Well, in light of Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18, it says that God made humans to inhabit the earth. But when we're dead, we no longer inhabit the earth, we're put under the earth. So, as far as God is concerned, a dead human is a displaced human. And so, Paul, in this context, Paul takes that word abyss and applies it not to demons or to Satan, but instead applies it to humans who are in a certain state of displacement, of death. So, this is an example of how literary context makes a difference in how a particular word needs to be understood. So, to summarize, before interpreting a particular word, give attention to, in ascending order, first, its dictionary meaning in the original language, second, its grammatical form, and third, to its historical and literary context. Remember, context is king. Now, you might have just come to the understanding by this point that when you're doing biblical word studies, you're going to need to make use of technical resources, whether they are printed resources such as Bible encyclopedias, lexicons, um, you know, word dictionaries, or you might even make use of online resources. Two of my favorite are the Bible Hub website, as well as the Blue Letter Bible website, but there are others. And so you're going to need to make use of technical resources to do these word studies because very few of us have a background in biblical languages. So just understand that, and I encourage you to make use of these resources. So getting started with our word study proper for today, there are 7 different words that are used in the Old Testament to refer to law in its various aspects. And now nearly all of these Hebrew words are translated by the rather broad English terms law and or ordinance. So when we read the word law or ordinance in our Bibles, we really need to find out what's going on behind that word, because scholars largely treat these various Hebrew words as being just synonyms for one another, largely interchangeable. But however, a closer look at these various terms reveals that they actually are not just simply interchangeable for one another, that there are certain relationships that exist among these terms that we need to be aware of. So we're going to take a look at 4 of these 7 Hebrew words that are commonly translated law. And the first of these is the Hebrew word torah. And now this is the broadest of the Hebrew words that are used for law. Torah, the dictionary meaning is instruction, teaching, or law. This particular term focuses on the educational and developmental aspects of the law, the pedagogical aspects, what you would expect when someone is teaching or training someone. So this word Torah encompasses every aspect of the law. It does not matter whether that law might be regarded as moral, civil, or ceremonial. Understanding that we're using those three terms in this presentation without formally defining them. We'll take that up in our next presentation. So some examples of how Torah just encompasses, it envelops the other words that are used for law. We can find many examples of this throughout the Old Testament. One example is in Exodus chapter 18, verse 20, where the Lord is speaking to Moses, and you shall teach them the statutes. That's the Hebrew word huqqa, and the laws, torah, and show them the way in which they must walk and the work they must do. So we clearly see the educational, the pedagogical, the developmental aspect of Torah in this particular verse. They must be shown and they must be taught. And concerning the Passover, the Lord said, once again speaking to Moses in Exodus chapter 12, verse 49, one law, Torah, shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. So we see that that word Torah can apply to ceremonial laws, such as the Passover. It can apply to other types of law as well. Exodus chapter 24, verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and be there, and I will give you the tablets of stone, the law, Torah, and commandments, mitzvah, which I have written that you may teach them. Once again, we see the teaching aspect of Torah, but we also see that Torah is associated with the 10 Commandments law. It encompasses all of them. And then a final example in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 46. These are the statutes, huqqa, and the judgment, mishpat, and the laws, torah, which the Lord made between himself and the children of Israel on Mount Sinai by the hand of Moses. So this Torah encompasses all of the regulations, guidelines, and statutes that were associated with the Lord's covenant with his people. So Torah is the first of these words, and it is the broadest. Our next word for law is the word huqqa. Huqqa is the feminine form of the noun hok. So notice that in Hebrew and Greek, that nouns have gender. So huqqa is the feminine form of the noun hok, which means something prescribed or enacted, what today we would call a statute, a piece of legislation. Now, huqqa and hok both derive from the verb hakak, which means to cut in, to inscribe, and by extension to decree. So this is suggesting a type of law that has been written down in some form, whether it is in ink on a piece of parchment or whether it has been chiseled into a piece of stone. It has been recorded in writing in some form or fashion. Now, both of these terms, huqqa as well as hok, are used in connection with ritual observances, with ceremonial laws. For example, the Passover in Exodus chapter 12, verse 24, and also with priestly regulations in Leviticus chapter 6 is dealing with the grain offerings. And in verses 22 and 23, it uses this word huqqa to describe how the priests are to handle these offerings. So we see huqqa is used in connection with ceremonial regulations, but they could also refer to moral regulations, such as in Exodus chapter 15, where we find recorded the experience of the bitter waters of Marah. And after the people had received water to drink, Moses charged them that if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord and keep his huqqa, his moral laws, his regulations, that he would put none of the diseases that afflicted the Egyptians upon them. So we see that this word huqqa is used in connection with ceremonial law as well as with moral laws. The next Hebrew word for law is the word mishpat. Mishpat, the dictionary meaning, is judgment, and it derives from the Hebrew verb shafat, which simply means to judge or to govern. So in today's world, mishpat would be what we would call case law or legal precedent. This is a type of law that is established as judges seek to apply legal principles to real world situations, and they establish various precedents that are followed in the future. So one reflection of this meaning of mishpat is on the Urim and the Urim and the Thummim that were used by the high priest to receive the Lord's decision on certain matters. This Urim and Thummim were located on the breastplate of judgment. That word judgment is the word mishpat. So the Urim and Thummim, which were worn by the high priest, were located on his breastplate of mishpat. So we see that this word mishpat has to do with weighing out issues and applying principles to certain situations and arriving at a judgment on a matter. So this term deals with the law as applied to real life everyday situations. And this is the type of law that is often described in civil regulations. So for instance, the law of betrothal found in Exodus chapter 21. This law established that female servants who have been betrothed by her master or by her master's son must be dealt with fairly and compassionately, that they could not be abused or neglected. So that's one example. Another example appears in Leviticus chapter 19, where we find regulations on weights and measures, that they had to be honest, that you couldn't have, any, shady, a shady ruler or anything, that you had to fly right when you're dealing with other people in financial matters. Okay, and we saw that goes back to the the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal. But mishpat also dealt with broader issues of justice, such as those relating to justice for the poor and impartiality in in making legal judgments. So on the one hand, judges were not allowed to discriminate against the poor because they were poor, but neither were they allowed to show partiality toward the poor because they were poor. Whether a person was poor or whether they were rich, both had to be treated fairly before the law. And this word mishpat even extended to certain ceremonial regulations, such as the guidelines for burnt offerings in Leviticus chapter 5 and in verse 9 are described as mishpat. So we see that the mishpat covers moral, civil, and ceremonial laws. The final term for law that we want to focus on is mitzvah. Mitzvah is translated commandment, and this derives from the verb savah, which means to command or to order. So there are three observations that we need to make about the use of this word mitzvah in context of the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, which are commonly called the Torah. There are 3 observations that we need to make about how this word is used in context. Remember, context is king. The first is that this word mitzvah is always, without exception, used in connection with God's authority and relationship to his people. And it is often used in direct reference to the 10 Commandments. So, some examples. In the law of Moses, the Lord claims the mitzvah as belonging to him. For instance, when we read in Exodus chapter 20, verse 6, but showing mercy to thousands. Remember, this is from the Second Commandment. But showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. The word used there is mitzvah. And notice he says, my mitzvah. Why is this so important? It's because the 10 Commandments are self-referencing. In other words, the 10 Commandments, they exist within themselves, sort of like a reflection of God. He says, I am that I am. The 10 Commandments are essentially saying the same thing. We are because we are. They self-reference themselves. So God claims these commandments as his own in a way that self-references themselves in the same way that he does for himself. We're going to see in upcoming presentations how the 10 Commandments, the second commandment in particular, reflects the character of God. Leviticus chapter 4, verse 2, if a man sins unintentionally against any of the commandments, mitzvah of the Lord, the mitzvah of the Lord, in anything which ought not be done, and does any of them, then it goes on to prescribe the sin offering that would need to be made. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 14, you shall therefore keep his statutes and his commandments, mitzvah, which I commanded you today. So notice that the Lord claims the mitzvah as his own, and these mitzvah refer directly to the 10 Commandments. And it's not just in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but we find this same pattern holds largely throughout the Old Testament, although there are certain instances where this term mitzvah is used to refer to a decree made by a human king to his subjects. But in general, in the Old Testament, this term mitzvah is reserved for this particular understanding of the Lord's commands to his people in the context of the 10 Commandment law. The second thing that we need to understand about mitzvah within the context of the books of Moses is that mitzvah always deals with the standard by which right and wrong, sin and righteousness, blessings and curses are determined. In other words, mitzvah always makes a distinction between 2 groups. We see examples of this concerning the rebellious Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, and this was in Exodus chapter 16, when they were complaining about manna. God gave them the manna with certain guidelines that they were to follow, collect a certain amount each of the first 5 days of the week, but on the 6th day, collect a double amount, because on the 7th day, they would be none. Well, some of them did not collect the double amount on the 6th day, went out on the 7th day expecting to find manna on the ground. There was none. And so the Lord said to his Moses about those people, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments, mitzvah, and my laws? So he was making a distinction between those Israelites who had followed the instructions and those who had not. In Leviticus chapter 16, verses 14 through 16, once again, we see a distinction being made by mitzvah. But if you do not obey me and do not observe all these commandments, mitzvah, so that you do not perform all of my commandments, mitzvah, but break my covenant, I also will do this to you. I will even appoint terror over you. So mitzvah always makes a distinction based on God's moral standard. That's the second thing we need to understand about this term within the context of the books of Moses. And the third thing that we need to understand about this term is that anytime the term mitzvah is mentioned in relation to a civil or a ceremonial issue, the emphasis is never on the regulation itself, but it is instead on the moral principle that underlies the regulation. We see an example of this in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 12 through 15, which deals with the law of tithing, which was a ceremonial regulation. And this particular passage refers to this law of tithing using the term mitzvah. It says, your commandments, mitzvah, which you have commanded me. And the reason that it refers to the law of tithing using this term mitzvah is not because of the law of tithing itself, but because of the moral principles that that law was based on, which trace directly back to the 10 Commandments. What are the moral principles that tithing rests on? Well, it rests on the 7th commandment, honesty and integrity in handling God's property. Tithing recognizes that what we have does not belong to us. But the principle of tithing also traces back to the 10th commandment, which deals with selfless giving. Tithing acknowledges that the increase that we have is not to be consumed on our own desires, but is instead to be used to further the work of God and also to promote the health and well-being of other people. You can see Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 through 10, which reflects this very same understanding of tithing in light of the 7th and 10th commandment. So, what can we conclude from our word study today? Well, we can reach several conclusions. First of all, we saw that the term Torah is best seen as an umbrella term that captures all of the dimensions of divine law, which were expressed in the law of Moses, in the books of Moses. So Torah is the broadest of the terms. We saw that the more specific terms, that there is often overlap in how those more specific terms apply to various categories or various aspects of divine law, especially the moral ones. We saw that mishpat and huqqa may refer to civil and ceremonial regulations in addition to moral ones. However, mitzvah is the exception. Mitzvah only refers to moral standards which were tied to God's authority and his relationship to his people, specifically the 10 Commandments law, but it also included those moral principles which underlie civil and ceremonial regulations which were derived from the 10 Commandment law. So if we were to present the relationship of overlap in all of these various Hebrew terms for law, we could present it in a fashion that looks similar to this. If we have the moral law, the civil law, and the ceremonial laws just placed next to one another, we see that the terms torah, huqqa, mishpat extend over all three of these categories in some form or fashion. But the term mitzvah, we see that that applies to only the moral law and principles. That is a finding that will be significant going into our next presentation, where we are going to be looking more specifically at the threefold categorization of the Old Testament law: moral, civil, and ceremonial. So it's my prayer that this presentation helped to just clarify the understanding of what law means in the Old Testament. And it's my prayer that as you continue to search and study and reflect on God's word, that you would be drawn into a closer relationship with him as you come to a better understanding of his will for his will for your life. So until next time, I just want to encourage you to be strong, continue to pray, continue to search the word of God. Also, look out for our Facebook page, which will be coming soon. So until next time, take care.